is we often think, oh, the way to develop toughness is through this kind of authoritarian, demanding control model where essentially the parent, the coach, the leader is a dictator. And it's my way or the highway. I'm going to teach you how to be tough by doing crazy things and being in control. Well, that model might have worked a little bit, 50, 60, 70 years ago when options were limited and the power dynamics were so skewed between maybe the coach and the athlete or the parent and the kid. But now that we live in, the 2020s, it, the world is different. People have options. It's not like, I joined the high school football team or else I have nothing else to do. There's options here. And that optionality means that like you have to actually earn trust and buy-in instead of just being given it because, you're the sole authority figure in this person's life. And earning trust and buy-in means like that takes serious effort and work, and you can't just kind of do it the old-fashioned cheap way.
Welcome to the Cutting Edge Coaching Podcast, where we believe coaches are some of the most important teachers and leaders in the world, and they deserve to be supported. I'm your host, Luke Gromer, and every week we're bringing you conversations with coaches, experts, and leaders from across sports that will give you practical ideas and strategies that you can apply in your coaching to develop high-performing teams and high-character people. Coaches, I'm excited to welcome Steve Magness to the podcast. Steve is a world-renowned expert on performance. He's the author of the new book, Do Hard Things, Why We Get Resilience Wrong, and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness. He's the co-author of Peak Performance, The Passion Paradox, and the author of The Science of Running. Collectively, his books have sold more than 500,000 copies in print, ebook, and audio formats. Steve has served as an executive coach to individuals in a variety of sectors. His work serves on applying the principles of which he writes. He's also the co-founder of The Growth Equation, a popular podcast and newsletter that explores the art, science, and practice of sustainable excellence. In this two-part conversation, we dive into Steve's latest book, Do Hard Things, Why We Get Resilience Wrong, and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness. As always, if you enjoyed this episode and want to grab a copy of the free podcast notes, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free PDF of notes from this episode or any episode of the podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about the resources we offer coaches, just check out the links in the show details or go to cuttingedgecoach.com. Now to my conversation with Steve Magness. Enjoy the episode. Coaches, really excited to welcome Steve Magness to the podcast today. Steve, really appreciate you joining me, and I would love it if we could start off and talk about something I know you're passionate about. The myth or the misconception around kids these days being quote unquote soft.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I love this topic, so I'm glad you started here. Um, so the funny thing about this idea of kids being soft is in researching my new book, which is all about toughness, I was like, well, you hear this all the time. I was reading this book by a football coach that was written in like 1910, right? And there was this chapter where all he's doing is complaining about kids these days, like they're not as tough, like we've got to like get them prepared and like they don't know how to work like we used to, and our generations, like our society is going to crumble because of it. So it's our job as football coaches to get them prepared. And I just found that fascinating because it seems like it's this trope that we've carried, for generations that just kind of won't go away. And I think what it means is it's not that kids are soft. It's that every generation is a little bit different because we grow up in a different environment. And I think what we're really saying is kids are a little different now than when I grew up. Well, no duh. Like you grew up 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Things have changed. They're adapting to their environment. So they should be different. If they weren't, we'd be in trouble. So, and then if you look at the data and all that stuff, is kids aren't any softer. Like, if you put them in the situation to do challenging things, they're going to do challenging things. It's just that, nowadays the challenges aren't often, hey, go out in the fields and do manual labor. Often the challenges are just a little bit different, and that's totally fine because, again, society and the world has changed and kids are adapting with it.
Yeah, I think yeah, I was just smiling to myself as you were sharing that, a book written in 1910, and it's the same thing that adults are complaining about. And I think there's a lot of truth in what you said there is, yeah, it's a common thing that the generation above does to the generation below. We have that perception, but like you said, they're growing up in a different world and they're adapting to it. And I think sometimes it can be a little bit of a cop out for the adults to change and grow and figure out how do I actually lead these people well? Like, it's a lot easier to just complain about kids being quote unquote soft than it is to figure out, well, how do I support them? How do I challenge them appropriately? And this is what we're about to get into. How do I actually help them develop resilience and toughness? And so, well, let's go into that, into the topic of your new book, resilience and toughness. And I'd love maybe if we kind of continued on the thread of, maybe what do we get wrong when we think about resilience and toughness and mental toughness, especially in a sport environment.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that up because it is kind of a cop out. And I think the reason that occurs is pretty simple, is that when it comes to resilience and toughness, we often hold on to these old school models, which the old school model is essentially put your head down, bulldoze through everything, ignore the pain, this discomfort, what you're feeling. If you have doubts, like push them away, don't even realize that, or recognize them, and just do whatever you can to survive. And you know what? Every once in a while, the what I'd call the like bulldoze or take the hammer to it approach, like sometimes you need to be able to do that. But the problem is that is like giving everybody a hammer and saying, here is your one tool, fix everything with it. Whatever challenge you come across, use this. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't apply to, society and the world that we live in, which requires a diversity, a number of tools, and is incredibly complex society. So now we need even more tools to handle challenges that didn't even exist, a decade or two ago. So, I think that's what we get wrong when we go to this old school toughness model. And the other part of that, which gets back to this like kids are soft days, is we often think, oh, the way to develop toughness is through this kind of authoritarian, demanding control model where essentially the parent, the coach, the leader is a dictator. And it's my way or the highway. I'm going to teach you how to be tough by doing crazy things and being in control. Well, that model might have worked a little bit, 50, 60, 70 years ago when options were limited and the power dynamics were so skewed between maybe the coach and the athlete or the parent and the kid. But now that we live in, the 2020s, it, the world is different. People have options. It's not like, I joined the high school football team or else I have nothing else to do. There's options here. And that optionality means that like you have to actually earn trust and buy-in instead of just being given it because, you're the sole authority figure in this person's life. And earning trust and buy-in means like that takes serious effort and work, and you can't just kind of do it the old-fashioned cheap way.
Yeah, yeah, I love that, and I like that you highlighted that y yeah, the reality is our world, again, is different, and there's a lot of options. I think it's important too to recognize that, because a kid quits something and chooses something else, that doesn't mean they're soft either, right? There's more options. We don't fault adults when adults quit a job and go find another one, but we look at kids and we're like, "Oh, they're soft." Or a kid transfers for a better option, right? At the collegiate level, like, "Ah, that's no." Like, again, we don't fault adults when we look for a greener pasture or a next step in our career. Yeah. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, you're spot on. Yeah, you're spot on. I think that's a brilliant thought because we hold it to different standards. Just look at athletics. We never fault coaches for jumping ship, really. We might say, "Oh, that sucks. I want them to coach my team," but we recognize, well, they're going over to this other team, which maybe is paying them more. This other school, which is paying them more and has more, opportunities. We don't fault adults for changing jobs. I mean, we just went through not too long ago the great resignation, which was actually the great switching of jobs. It's not that people just quit jobs and didn't have anything else to do. They went through a very trying time and said, you know what? This job kind of sucks. I want to do something that better aligns with, my passions and my pursuits. So I'm going to try these other things over here. We don't say, "Oh, you're soft." We say, yeah, that is often the right move. But like you said, with kids and, athletes often we say, back in my day, like you couldn't transfer, so you just had to stick it out or like, when we start things, we finish them. And that sounds good on a superficial level, but mindless persistence in something that makes us miserable is not going to teach us a good lesson. If, little Johnny or Susie absolutely hates football, then persisting through the football season isn't going to ingrain a love of sport or football. It's going to be, this thing sucks. Well, maybe if they switched and played baseball or softball or soccer or ran track or found something that better aligned with their interests that was still challenging, that might instill that lifelong love of a sport and activity that they can carry through and maybe even excel at. So again, I think it's like we glorify these ideas of never quit and almost like mindlessly persist. And instead, we need to, treat the children just like we do with adults. It's like there's no glory in sticking out a horrible job that makes you miserable. Find something that you enjoy that fulfills your needs that you can excel at. And if the current job isn't that and you got to quit, like that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. It's setting you up to for success over the long haul.
Yeah, I think that's a really important mindset shift for coaches to make. Just in the way we talk about athletes and the way that we respond when that situation does happen, when the kid comes in and says, "Coach, I'm done." We could be curious and then we should be support. Okay, like there's other options for them, and I'm going to respect that. I think it's really important for us to, yeah, keep that at the forefront of our mind. It doesn't mean they're soft. It's okay. Again, we wouldn't bemoan an adult for doing it, and who knows, like, maybe they come back to it. That's okay. Like, it's okay if that's the experience that they have.
Y Luke, I'm gonna tell you a story from my childhood that illustrates this perfectly. For the listeners who don't know, like, I was a very good high school runner. I was a state champion, number 1 in the nation my senior year in high school, 4-minute 401 miler as a high schooler. But I remember distinctly in 5th grade, everybody runs the PE physical fitness mile, right? It's just what everybody does. So I run the physical fitness mile. I miss our elementary school record by a few seconds. The PE teacher says, like, "Oh, Steve, like, you can train and try again, like in a couple months or a month or two to set this record. And maybe you should try track." And at that time, I was a soccer player. I love soccer. I was just good at running, because I was good at, a soccer player. So I go home. I'm all excited. I said, okay, you know, I'm gonna go for the school record. My dad says, "Great, like let's train." He takes me down to the track, you know, asks me if I want to join track, all that good stuff. I last one day. I do one workout at the track and I say, "This is freaking miserable. Why would anyone do this sport at all? This is horrible. Like I want to go back to play soccer where I'm having fun with my friends and not going through this pain and fatigue." So after one day I quit track. And, like, I didn't pick it up for years until the interest and the talent seemed to align when I hit high school, where I was like, "Oh, I am really good at this. Oh, I can see why people enjoy doing this thing that I used to think sucked." And I just think back on that, and I'm like, what if my dad would have said, "No, Steve, like, you have talent in this and you must, like, finish what you started. So we're going to go through a track season." I probably would have learned to hate this thing because I wanted to go play soccer over here. So sometimes it's like, you know, you got to allow kids to explore and allow some freedom to figure it out themselves. And in that moment in 5th grade, I wasn't ready to, figure out that track was something that I actually would enjoy. So again, from my own life, there's that lesson is like, don't force people, allow them the freedom to explore things, but like if it's gonna fit, it will fit at the right moment at the right time.
My mind is still blown that you ran a 4 minute and 1 second mile. I can't even wrap my mind around that. But thanks for sharing that story. That's really, really insightful. And yeah, there's a lot of truth in what you just shared there. I want to talk more about something you mentioned earlier as far as, kids have these options, and it's so important that we earn trust and buy-in, that we actually earn it. I want to talk about that, and then after that, want to get into really some of the research around, how do we help them build resilience and embrace doing hard things. But before we do that, talk more about how do we actually, yeah, earn trust and buy-in with the modern athlete that's in front of us, this generation.
Yeah, it's a tricky topic. It's one that I've actually spent a lot of time with professional sports teams talking about because, again, there's so many options. And then the other thing that we have to realize is the environment has shifted in the sense that, with social media, especially, athletes are, judged at all moments essentially on how they're doing and what they're doing. There's no kind of that private moment to deal with stuff. So how do you how do you get trust in buying? So there's a couple simple things that stand the test of time that but also apply more now than ever, which is you essentially want to establish trust, which research shows that it's not, hey, first that I trust someone and then I show them who I am and I'm vulnerable to them. To establish trust, you essentially have to show the athlete, hey, here's some vulnerability, here's some truth and reality behind me. I'm opening up to you. And that almost sends a signal that says, oh, this coach, this leader, this person of authority is like trusting me. So if they trust me by telling me this, then I can reciprocate that. And that's how that trust is built. So it's really being real and vulnerable at the forefront. So it's not putting on this like facade of perfection, but of, hey, I understand those struggles. Like I went through some things like that myself when I was your age, or like I've had other athletes go through this, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing that is really important for that trust and buy-in is fulfilling people's basic kind of like psychological needs. If you look at, there's a well researched theory called self determination theory that essentially says if we want people to be intrinsically, internally motivated, then we have to provide them with a sense of autonomy so that they feel like they have a voice and some choice and some sense of direction in where they're headed. So it's not just forced or imposed upon them. They have to feel a sense of competency or the feeling that they can get better. So there is room for growth and progress in this sport, in this field. And then the third one, which is really important, is belonging, which they have to feel like they belong. And I think we often get this one so wrong with that old school model because we create environments that are almost like fear based instead of environments that says, hey, when you walk through this door into this locker room, like you're part of a team. Like this is a place where you can be yourself and you belong to something much greater than just, you as an individual. Is I have your back. We have your back. Yes, we're going to argue and fight and kind of do those things like a family would, but at the end of the day, we're all aligned towards this common shared goal, and that creates that sense of community. So really, if you can establish those things in your team or your program or your organization, that's how you create that kind of trust and sense of community that allows people to thrive instead of just kind of surviving it.
Yeah, self-determination theory keeps coming up in conversations that I have with coaches and researchers, and I love those 3 pieces of it. And I really, really like what you shared around the reality of building trust is that we must be vulnerable first, that precedes the building of trust. Um, if we wait for the trust to be there before we're vulnerable, it probably won't be there to the level we want it or need it to be. And actually, that it jogged a couple thoughts in my mind. Here's the first one, and actually a brief story for you. I got this idea from a fellow coach, and it was around the idea of non-negotiables. So this past summer, I took over a new team and a new job, and non-negotiables, essentially coach standards. An answer to the question of like, this is what I need from you guys as athletes to be successful as a coach. And so, but the tip that I got from this guy, he said, before you give yours, ask them the same question. And so, very first practice, I hadn't met these kids yet. First practice together, and we huddled up, and I said, introduced myself, said a couple things, said, "Okay, guys, I have a question for you. I want you to talk about it in groups of 2 or 3. What do you need from me as your coach to be successful?" And they're kind of like, "Huh? Okay." They kind of look around at each other. Kind of, I could tell, like, kind of caught off guard by the question. But then they talk in small groups, and then we share out. And essentially, their answers boiled down to tell us the truth, challenge us, challenge us, and be transparent or be a real person with us. And I was like, I mean, you couldn't ask for better answers from athletes. Like it's like if your team tells you that, like, yes, I've got, like, I can tell them the truth. They want me to challenge them, and they want me to be a real person. This is incredible. And then after that, I said, okay, great. Like, I'm committed to doing those things for you guys. And then I said, now here's what I need from you to be successful. And this is just an anecdote, but the level of reception I felt from them, I feel like was so significantly different just because I led with uh, like them putting it in theirs first. Hey, what do you need from me? Throwing it over to them. Any thought or reaction to that?
I mean, I love it, Luke. Honestly, I think there's a couple things that you did brilliantly there. First is it does feel a little bit different for them because you're almost flipping the script. They're used to, again, almost like this one way communication. The coach leads and tells us what to do. And you're flipping that around and saying, "Hey, like, I want you to have a voice. I want to hear your thoughts first." Which often catches people off guard, but that's actually a good thing because it kind of lowers that barrier and puts them out of defensive mode and into kind of receptive, okay, let's evaluate this thing. And then the other thing that I love there is you started with like small groups of 2 or 3 before coming up to the broader, team. And I think what that does is it allows everybody to have a voice. Because often in large groups, what happens is like the couple quote unquote leaders or more extroverted people will speak up, and others who might have great thoughts or ideas just don't because it's not their personality. So starting in small groups allows everybody to actually wrestle with that question and have thoughts around it, and then it brings it to the greater team. And I think the last thing that I love is, okay, great, like you got their feedback first and then you reciprocate that, which is what we just talked about. So again, I like to see it as, if you're a coach, like seeing a little bit of that partnership, getting owner allowing the athletes to take ownership in what they're doing. And there's actually some wonderful research in the corporate world that looks at something similar, which in the corporate world, you often have, um, core values and mission statements and all these things, which we often use in sport. But in the corporate world, what often happens is it's imposed on the people. So, like, you see all these core values painted in the buildings or in the office or, in the pamphlets that they hand out to you. But none of the workers actually had any input on those core values. They were just imposed upon them. And the research shows they don't work when you just impose upon it, right? In order for values and mission statements and like all those things to work, you have to feel like, the majority of people have to feel like they actually are truly reflective of what matters in this organization. And I think the exact same thing is true in sport. If we sit here and say, "Hey, this is what our team stand for. This is, these are the rules, these are expectations." Well, great, but if the athletes had no kind of input or say, then you're not going to get in as high level of value or buy-in as if you give them a voice and some, choice. It doesn't mean you have to adopt everything they say, but what it does mean is that they feel like they can contribute. So I love that example, Luke. I think it's a wonderful, story of how to do that effectively.
Yeah, and I would say in response to what you were just sharing there around core values, I think at a minimum, you've got to let the group contextualize it and make it personal. For example, uh, one of my friends, JP Urban, he was talking about kind of the same concept of core values and when should you let your team come up with their own, or when should it be passed down and remain constant? And he used this example, and I'm guessing you're familiar with them, of like the New Zealand All Blacks. He was like, if I took over as the coach there, I would not change their core values because they're steeped in tradition, right? But you would let that group contextualize it. Hey, what are the behaviors that align with these core values? And so, yeah, I don't know that you probably know more about the research than I do, but I don't think there's maybe necessarily a perfect answer for every context. And I think that it does ring true that they need to have some autonomy or a voice in saying, this is what it looks like for us to live these out.
Exactly. I mean, that's a great example, and that's where this nuance comes of it for your situation is, of course, you're not going to replace the All Blacks' core values, um, but there's a reason for that because there is history and tradition that essentially says like here are the standards, and this goes beyond you. It reflects decades of individuals, so that you're part of this greater narrative than just you or yourself. But I love the idea of, well, what does this mean to you? What does this mean to our team? Because there again, you're going from, okay, I'm just going to impose this and tell you, to you're going to have a voice and some input on this. Is how are we going to apply this? And often that application side of it or phase of it gets towards that autonomy piece because now we're personalizing it. Now it means something to us. And it's not, again, just kind of a slogan on the wall, but it's something that has that personal meaning and value that, actually reflects something that we believe in, which I think, again, makes it much more powerful and long lasting than if I just said, here's what we stand for, like take it or leave it, you know, no input whatsoever.
Totally. I want to ask you a question about belonging. I think more and more coaches recognize how important it is. I think more and more coaches want to create an environment where that's what their athletes feel. And I think one of the most challenging parts of that, especially in sport, is that performance is a factor. Now, this again is contextually specific. I don't think that this should apply at the youth level. Like every kid should be playing, right? But as you progress, high school, college, professional levels, they must perform too. So, can you talk about creating belonging in an environment where performance is also a factor? Because the reality is, in some of these contexts, if you don't perform, you won't be there like much longer, probably. So, how do you actually balance those things of everyone belongs and you must perform as well?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I'm glad you asked that. So, to give you the answer here, I'm going to go back to a lesson I learned when I was in graduate school. I was fortunate to take a class um, from from Charlie Casserly, who was the former NFL general manager of the Washington Redskins and Houston Texans. And he won a Super Bowl with the Redskins as the general manager. And I remember him, it was like a small class of like 6 or 7 people. And I remember having this discussion where he brought up this rule he had that said, everybody in the building matters. And often it's the bottom 10 or 20% of the team or organization that you really have to pay attention to. Because the guys who are on the practice squad or the guys who are never going to get into the game, those are often the ones who go through a revolving door, right? They're here this season, gone the next, here a couple months, replaced after that. And it's very easy for the culture of the team to go sideways because you have these guys who, we're preaching team and belonging, but they might be let go and replaced. So his solution was you have to be very clear on what their role is and the expectations and the reality of it. And then also let them know why their role is vital and important and how are they contributing. So the guys who are on the practice, like you might not ever see a game, but you are literally preparing our starters for, what they're gonna face. And the better you can maybe mimic this other player that we're asking you to mimic, like you might not get in the game, but you're helping our star quarterback or our wide receiver or cornerback. You're helping them prepare, which allows us to win. And that has always stuck with me to create that belonging and sense is that if you just lie to them and you say, hey, we're all a family and we're all a team, which is kind of true, but like a family is not going to just say, hey, son, like you're no longer my son. Goodbye. Like go find another family. So I think that you have to deal with that reality, which again gets to that clarity and honesty of it. People understand that it's a job as well, and there's a reality of it. And if you level with them and you say, "Hey, look, here's your job, here's your role. Like this is how you are vital and contributing, but there's also a chance that like you might be replaced. But I'm going to be upfront and I'm going to be honest and I'm going to tell you like, if this is a possibility or if this is the direction we're going and why we're going to do that and how this might help potentially help you in the future for preparing maybe for the next season or the next team or what have you better if you did your job well. And I think leveling with people allows you to again, create that sense of belonging without the kind of fakeness that often comes with it when, we can't when we have to let go of people if they don't perform. And that's there's no perfect answer, but that's how I've kind of handled things in the past and what I always return and reflect upon.
The two words that were coming to my mind when you were sharing that was honesty and value. We got to be honest with them, and we've got to make them see and understand that we still value them regardless of, what the role is. Because I really believe that athletes, kids, adults, young adults, you name the level, they want to know where they stand. It might be uncomfortable. They might not love the conversation in the moment, but clarity about this is where you are is way better than ambiguity or never having the conversation. And then I think that just breeds distrust. Like I'm not playing, I'm not getting opportunity, and I don't even know why. Right. And as a coach, you're preaching that these things matter. I feel like I'm doing these things, but I don't know. I'm just left in the dark. And so I just think it's so important, like you said, is that we level with people. We're honest with them about where they're at. And that's uncomfortable for us as coaches sometimes. But like you said, to try to keep that environment of belonging, that trust, I think it's so important that we do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at the research on burnout in the office workspace, lack of role clarity is one of the biggest contributors where they feel like, they aren't getting that clarity on what they're supposed to do and what the expectations are and how they're contributing from their manager. So that causes this stress, uncertainty, and anxiety, which causes them to burn out. And I think it's the same in the sporting world. And I think the other thing that is really important, and whenever I've been in this situation in the past where it's like you're dealing with performance, which is a little cutthroat, is I often try and, broaden their perspective. So if I have that person who might, I might level with them and they might not be performing enough to stay on the team or stay in their role. You can say, "Hey, look at the bigger picture here. Is you might not make it on this team, but if you give the effort, if you do what I ask you to do, I promise I'm going to help you and prepare you in whatever way that helps your future." Which might mean, if you're looking at the fourth string quarterback on a football team, you might say like, "Hey, I appreciate the work and all but you're not going to cut it. But you know what? Like, I've noticed these skills which might prepare you wonderfully for after your playing career to, coach. And like, here's some advice and some input and maybe some entry level door that might prepare you for that. Have you thought about that?" Or different aspects like that where you're saying, "Hey, here's how these skills can prepare you outside of this, even if you don't make the team or even if you let go." And again, I think that honesty is really important to help you navigate some of those difficult situations, which we often kind of find ourselves in a world where, at the end of the day, especially in the high level sport, not the youth sport, but high level sport, like performance still matters.
Coaches, thanks for listening to this episode, and thanks to Steve for joining me. You can find links to connect with Steve or buy his new book in the show details. As always, if you enjoyed this episode and you want to grab a copy of the free podcast notes, go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details. Download a detailed PDF of notes from this episode of the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, would you take a minute to either share a takeaway with us on Twitter or share it with a coaching friend? Those things go a long way in helping us share with more coaches who can then impact more athletes. Thanks for listening to the podcast.